may think less of me, seeing that I am a wizard of high repute, but I don't have a functional wizard hat. In fact, I own very little in the way of hats. I wish I could tell you, dear counsel, that this was because I didn't look good in hats. It's quite the opposite. There's nothing I love more than a big dramatic hat. The sad reality of it all is that I'm just absolutely rubbish at hattery of all varieties. Every attempt has been an utter failure. The conclusion that I've come to is that I have skills that are in need of sharpening, and a burning urge to make an abundance of silly hats. I have my heart set on 5 hats I've seen floating around on the internet for a bit. A bard hat, a chainmail coif, a Jesters Cap and bells, a Juliet Cap, and, most daunting of all, a double Hennin. A good fancy hat requires a whole load of trims and beads and textures to bring it to life proper, so I started with a rifle through my stash of wizard trash. Finding that I am somewhat lacking in the trims and general finery department, I found it best to venture out to my favourite local charity shop. I find the best places to gather unique components are places like these. Sure, you could stop off at a craft shop or fabric shop and gather exactly what you're looking for with ease, but I like sorting through dusty shelves and baskets and letting that inspire me. Limitation is the mother of all creativity after all. Before I start, I'd just like to express that my knowledge of medieval clothing, hats, food and ornament is shaped almost exclusively by 80s fantasy movies and video games. While I thoroughly enjoy watching creators who focus on historical tailoring and experimental archaeology, my focus on fun, whimsical, historically inspired goodies is purely anachronistic and based in fanciful flights of fantasy. I'm just here to be a silly little wizard on the internet and make things with a very loose knowledge on what the historical relevance of that thing may be. That being said, if you do harbour forbidden knowledge on any of these things I'm making, please feel free to share. I do enjoy learning new things. Right, that's enough faffing. Let's get started. The pattern for this hat is pretty simple. All you need is a nice big circle and a long rectangle. The circle will be the body of the hat, and the rectangle will end up as the bit that goes round your head. My circle ended up being around 60 centimeters in diameter, roughly 23 inches in accordance with the goggle, which I recommend for a more than adequate level of poofiness. To get the band measurement, I like to use my old ribbon trick to get a measurement of my head. Simply wrap a ribbon round your noggin in a way that fits quite comfortably, cut it to size, then label it and store for all eternity, safe in the knowledge that your head most likely won't be changing shape anytime soon. Everyone's measurements for this will be different, but I'll share mine with you anyhow. For the main fabric, I'll be using this thrifted dress, which has a very pleasant texture, like a waxier, smoother satin. The one caveat of working around second-hand fabrics like this is that in order to get the size I want, I'll have this seam in the centre of the hat to deal with, but the hat will be so poofy that I really doubt it'll end up noticeable at all, so I'm going to use it anyway. I measure out an adequately equal square, the biggest I can get, fold that in half once, and then in half once again. To make my square into something far less like a square, I use a ruler to mark equal little dots in a curve, making sure to keep one end of my ruler on the inner corner of my folded fabric. I then join all those dots and cut along my wonky line work. Huzzah! Big circle! I'll be using some random scraps of fabric from my thrift expedition and my own stash to make the band of our cap. Using my ribbon measurement as a guide, I cut a folded strip of fabric just a wee bit bigger than I needed. Then I cut a bit of stabilizer just a wee bit smaller than I needed. This will give my band more structure, since this fabric is a little thin. I press the whole affair with my iron, then add my little sliver of stabilizer ham into a gold fabric sandwich and press it all again. You're going to notice a lot of pressing and sewing and pressing and interfacing and pressing and summoning the ancient tree herders of the land and pressing and etc. in this video. There's no way around it. It's impossible not to be pressed when making hats. That's just how it is. I pick the front end of my hat band. I'll be adding all my decorations to this bit before I sew things together to give it a nice finish on the inside. This red satin ribbon will add a nice pop of colour to the centre of the band, so I clumsily machine stitch it down. We'll be covering up the ugly bits anyhow with this lovely gold cord I had lying around. I make good use of my hand quilted craft mat and pin the cord into place. Then it's just a simple matter of tacking this cord down with some peaceful hand stitching. Much better. I added a line of beads as well, just for some subtle intrigue. Something nothing to catch in the candlelight. With the hand stitching done and all the ugly bits safely tacked away inside the band, I can now sew it shut by machine. Now I take the body of our hat and gather it with a tight running stitch. Why don't I just do this by machine, you ask? Excellent question, Council. The answer is twofold. I simply love hand stitching, even though I'm not particularly good at it. It just calms my nerves in a way no other magic can. The other reason, of course, is that I don't bloody well know how to use the sewing machine gathering method, and I don't care to learn. I always pull the wrong thread, or it snaps, or it's far too frustrating, and I just can't handle it. Whew. With the hat all gathered up, I place the poofy mess inside the band, right sides together with the embroidered decorative bits towards the top. Pin it in place and pop it into the machine to marry the edges together. While I indulge in some soft internal panicking at just how familiar this hat is starting to look, I flip the band the right way and fold the final unfinished edge inside so I can hand sew it shut with a whip stitch, being very careful not to poke through the gold fabric and leave any strange unwanted lines. To make this hat look a little less farquaad and a little more bardwood, I add on a lovely emerald green tassel from my stash and this beautiful metal button. Perhaps this bard of ours is from a coastal city and entertains the locals, busking along the beach with a sea shanty, a lyre, and a twinkle in his eye. Alas, we can wonder no more, as this hat is finished and we have others to make. I don't know the first thing about chainmail, nor do I have the means and materials to learn at the moment, but I am a mediocre crocheter with a whole drawer of excess wool to deal with, so my chainmail will be forged with a 12mm hook, some dark grey yarn, and pure, unadulterated hubris. As this pattern is not of my own making, I won't be explaining it in this video. I'd rather point you towards the video I used, which I truly feel deserves far more views. It's a free pattern with a write-up available on Instagram, and this creator is very much underrated, so please do go check them out. The link will be in the illuminated text that we call the video description down below. I'll only be telling you what extra little bits I end up adding to the process to make it a little bit more Middle-earth appropriate. To start, while working up the design, I added in a few strands of silver thread every now and again to act as a highlight for our metal. Though, looking back on it, I'm not certain they made much of a difference, and if I made this again, I would rather consider just using metallic wool to start, like this Katya Airlux. It's a fun alternative if you don't have access to a metallic wool. I would just recommend being far less subtle than I. This is one of those cases where more is more. Other than that, I just crochet the hat up like normal. I noticed that my crocheting seems to summon the rain. I wonder what I summon when I knit. Once my soft and fluffy chainmail is ready, I can sort through my shinies for some fun decorations. These bigger white cat eye beads will do nicely. I gather up a few extra bits of wire and chain and metal, a process that managed to take so long that the sky turned from silver to navy, and bound them all together into little beaded hangamabobs to attach one at a time to the coif in a configuration that invokes a bit of Joan of Arc, but with zero of the protective qualities and all of the ornament. That's another hat down! These are going really well! Alright, pattern for this one. What you'll need is a hat that fits you alright. I used a beanie because it's soft and easy to lay flat. I fold it in half and mark the top of the hat. This will be, and please try to contain your surprise here, the top of my hat. I then take my trusty head ribbon measurement and fold that in half, and then in half again, and mark that on the page. To add the liripipes, aka those pointy hangy bits that you find on Jesters Caps and the like, I add a long triangle to the top of my hat. Here's what my measurements ended up looking like. You can just use them if you want to skip all the pattern making parts, but you'll have to hope we have the same sized head. And mine's pretty big head. Don't put that in. This gives me 1/4 of my pattern. To make it a whole pattern, I would cut this piece out twice on a fold to give me 2 pieces, both with 2 points at the top. To start, I label my pattern, so that when I inevitably find it crumbled under the pile of chaotically chopped and glued papers I call my self-drafted pattern stash, I'll know what it was once supposed to be. I then summon forth my fabric scraps once more, looking for colours and combinations that made me feel like doing handstands and engaging in a few harmless japes. Since my fabric scraps are all quite small, I decided to chop a little portion of the top of my pattern. I'll do those bits in a different colour, which will add to our patchwork mess of fun. I cut out my 4 panels. I went with this mustard corduroy and a royal blue Duchess satin for the one side, and then a dark wine red and pastel paisley acetate style fabric for the other. My hope is to give each side their own unique look so that the hat can be somewhat reversible. With all these bits cut out, I can now do my favourite part, decorating. It truly has been the most fun part of all these hats. Finding what combination of ribbon, trim, beading or button goes well with whatever theme I've chosen has been such a lark, really. It also turns the pieces from janky costume into something a little more substantial and fancy. In all my earlier costumes, I never really spent the time to add on little bits like this, usually because I'm making them for a few people and it's easier just to get the bigger pieces out of the way and let the decorating fall by the wayside. But I think moving forward, I'd like to try my hand at putting a bit more love into the fancification of my garments. I just like these so much, and I want to feel that way about more of the things I make. Cool, listen to me babble. Let's get back to that hat, shall we? I used that pattern piece I chopped off earlier to cut out 4 triangles of gold fabric and sew them onto each end. Now our liripipes have been dipped in gold. To join all the parts together, this is the most technical segment of this hat, so please listen up, council. I sew one half of the hat right sides together along the side seam. I then sew the other end of the liripipe closed, careful to stop at the top of the head. I then do the same for the other half of the hat. I leave one half of the hat as it is, but turn the other inside out with the help of a knitting needle. I then place one half of the hat into the other half, and I make sure that the sides touching on the inside are the sides I want facing outside. I pin it all along that center seam, sew it up, and flip it right side out. And there we are, just a hat mostly done. To protect all the stitching from my feverish decorating on the inside, I'll need to add a lining to this hat. I used more of that dark red fabric, folded it over, and cut around the hat to make our lining shape. Don't worry too much about the seam allowance. We do want this lining to be a bit smaller than the outside. Now just sew that all together. To attach the jingly janglies and thusly turn our Jesters Cap into a Jesters Cap and bells, I use a needle and some embroidery floss and pull it through the end of one of the lining liripipes. I can then pull that all the way through our main hat's liripipe. This will help secure the lining to the main hat so it doesn't fall out, as well as provide more structure for my heavy dangly gold tassels to hang on. To finish everything off, I use some binding tape and close up the base of the hat and sew on a few extra bits of finery, like more trim, a clover button and a happy little moon charm, marking this hat as number 3 in our roster. After all the hard work that was the Jester's Cap, this Juliet Cap is pleasantly simple. The pattern is just 2 pieces of a vaguely eye-adjacent shape, roughly 16 centimeters in length. I'll be using a sliver of this sheer table runner folded in half to cut out our pattern pieces. I clip them together and sew along the curve. This will create the little characteristic rounded shape these sorts of hats tend to have. I use a French seam to trap the raw edges out of harm's fray, and now we're ready for decorating. I'll need a rounded shape that I can pin into for this. A victim, pardon me, volunteer. I pin the sheer hat to our willing participant's head and get to work. Most of the Juliet caps I've seen have a golden lattice looking bit, which I'm going to emulate with some metallic gold cord from my stash. I lay out the cord diagonally in one direction and pin the ends into the soft fluffy gourd before me. I'm sure I won't miss those brain cells too much. I do the opposite on the other end, and then I can secure the cord to the fabric via golden thread, one teeny tiny stitch at a time. Doing this lattice work by hand took some time, but in the end there's no bulk or hardness from any glue, and if I want to I can take it all apart and salvage all the individual pieces pretty easily. But while I may have a personal vendetta against hot glue and its kin, do not be swayed by my pro-hand sewing propaganda and do what suits you and your needs best in this case. Once I finish up the hand-stitched cords, I can embellish each point of cross with the smaller of the cat-eye beads. I really do love how these catch the light. The French seam in the middle of the hat is a wee bit unsightly, so I add a few more layers of the runner, careful not to remove too much, as I intend to use this for our next hat as well. Now I can cut off all the loose hanging bits of thread and bind the edges to bring to a close our quickest silly hat. There are things in this magical world that are sent to test us, things that we cannot comprehend, things that cause the wrinkled orbs in our heads to grow weary and strained and shake us to our very cores. For some, it may be ghosts. For others, the concept of the great unknown. For me, this bloody hat pattern. I can't show you how I made this pattern in a way that makes rational sense. It was a blur, really, a flurry of paper and patching and gluing that left me with something barely useful and in tatters. Instead, I'll show you what I should have done. Make a nice big paper cone that fits over one side of your head decently. Mark a front and back end and draw out a shape you like. I wanted it to go over my ears and have a little dip in the front. Add in extra bits of paper where necessary to help achieve the shape you like, and then cut it all out. Cut along the bottom side seam and flatten it to create your pattern. Alternatively, if this process causes you to curl up in a mound of paper at 3 AM and stress cry, just make a single hennin. They're still very pretty and much easier, and you might even have the energy to make it look more original and fun. Anyway, cracking on with the hat, since I'll be using the same scrap velvet I've had in my inventory for years, in some attempt to get rid of it, I'll need to cut my pattern into 2 pieces rather than one big one to start. I wanted to test something in the interest of saving a bit of time for this hat. Zigzag stitching over a bit of silver cord to create that lattice effect a bit quicker. If it works, it could be an easy way to add cordage like this to some future costumes. Hint hint. The results? Pretty great! I can definitely see myself using this method again, though I'm not sure how it will work for cords much larger than these. With the test results a total success, I can start by cutting out some stabilizer pieces. This stabilizer will force my inexpensive stretch velvet to behave in the machine, and also just in general. I cut one piece, flip the pattern, and cut the other. This makes up our 2 halves of the cover fabric. We'll get to the structure later. I line up my velvet so that the grain all faces the same way, and cut my pieces from there, again making sure to flip the pattern pieces so I end up with 4 parts of fabric that make up the 2 mirrored sides of our hennin. I'm going to refer to the 2 sides as spires to make things a little bit easier from here. I separate the 2 spires out and sew them individually along where I separated the pattern. I make sure the interlining piece sits well within the confines of the velvet. I press the velvet, add the interlining, press the interlining, add infinitum. To make the guide for my silver cord, I use a bit of string and a pin to help me mark out some lines. I'm not going for anything special here, just a nice big grid that gets a bit smaller towards the ends. To mirror my lines on the other side, I use an alcohol marker to trace them. This marker in particular bleeds through to the other side, which really helps. I then sew along all these lines. It may seem tedious, but it created a subtle guideline for me to follow on the other side. Since my tailor's chalk does not like this velvet, this was just the easiest way for me to mark my lines. Now to replace that tedious task with a different but equally tedious task. That being using the zigzag stitch to fasten long lines of silver to my flat hennin pieces using nothing but subtle black lines to guide my hand. I still feel my brain rattling round in my head. Once that's done, I can add in some little faux pearls from the Archwizard's stash. Most of my beads are from her stash. I wonder how she'd feel about me using them to decorate strange hats on the internet. And that's the outer layer. Now for the internal structure. I start with yet more interfacing on some rubbish suiting material scraps. I'm only using it because it's a little grippy, which I think will help the hat stay on my head. To make these things stand the way I need, I add in some boning channels using bias tape and zip ties, one at the top and bottom of the spire structure halves to keep them nice and pointy. Before I can add any more boning, I'll need to combine the halves. So I pin them along the center seam, making sure to clip my curves and sew them together. Around here is where the excitement started to build. I had no idea how this was going to look, and I really didn't have much hope in my own pattern. I sewed the sides closed eagerly and trimmed the seams down a bit. Hot glue time! I need to express that I do everything in my power to avoid the use of hot glue. It is very useful and does save time, but it's also bulky and permanent. Unless I'm absolutely certain I don't want to reuse a material somewhere else, I will look for any alternative method. But this structure has a lot of curves, and sewing those curves by machine or hand will be a nightmare. So to save myself any more tears, I'm just going to glue on the final zip ties for my structure. I added 1 bone in the center of my hat and 2 on either side to wrap around the spires and make sure they stay nice and round. Structure complete. I sew up the outer shell right sides together, flip it inside out, and sew on little jump rings to the points. You'll see why in a bit. To make the ends of my my pointed hat just that much more fancy, I add on some metal cone beads, which ended up being my favourite bit. I then pop the structure into the outer layer and bind it all off with some sage-coloured ribbon. I made 2 ties for the hat with the same ribbon by hand stitching them in, but I didn't film that because the process of wrangling this hat into my sewing machine was so utterly exhausting that I really fell off in the filming department towards the end here. For the finishing touches, I look through my stash once more, find a button I adore, attach it to the front, and oh look, it's that runner I said I was going to use again. I hastily hem up the side and attach claw clasps on either end to make a detachable little veil for my fancy hat. And that is hat number 5. Finally, I have a horde of medieval-esque fantasy hats for wearing. They were honestly such fun to make, and it's a miracle nothing at all went wrong. Alright, enough already. It's time to run around an old building with a naked mannequin I found in the garage and make a fool out of myself. These hats are definitely going down as some of my favourite things to make. It was fun to do a collection of projects with a similar theme like this, so I'll certainly be doing a few more of the like in the future. If I had to pick favourites, it'd be the Jesters Cap and bells for the sheer fun of decorating, but for wearing, I love how the bard hat sits on my head. Though, if I'm honest, the one I most like to show off to friends is the double Hennin. I mean, look at her, she's just so grand. I'd like to thank the denizens of the Nottingham Road Hotel for allowing me to film silly hats in their pub. If you're in the Midlands area, or if you ever find yourself at the bottom of the world for my overseas council members, I do hope you'll stop by the hotel. It's a lovely place, and the staff are strangely tolerant of idiot wizards running around their property with armfuls of head coverings. Anyway, it's time for these hats to join their wonky brother in my hat box. Perhaps in the future I'll make characters and costumes for each of the hats, but for now I've worked quite hard enough, and I think I've more than earned a nice warm cup of tea and a day's rest. Salutations, Council! This video was delayed a bit. I'm still very new to all of this, and I wasn't quite expecting to do so well on my first video. Within less than a month, I went from 143 council members to quite a bit more than that, and my intent was to just carry on like normal and not let it get to me, which was definitely easier said than done. But we made it. I think this was the scariest video I've ever posted, just because I don't see how it could do much better than my first. But it's out now, I've overcome the stress, I'm excited to make more. Thank you for 8,000 subscribers. I really can't express enough how happy it makes me to see so many clever, curious, crafty individuals stopping by and being so encouraging. It's a really beautiful experience, and I'm just content in the knowledge that I'm making stuff that people actually like. I also appreciate all of the feedback, audio, visual, font, etc. It helps me learn how I can improve, and I really want to do my very best on this channel. On that note, the Druid found this old camera, I sourced a charger for it, and the Ranger loaned me this very cute old tripod, so look forward to improved footage in the future. I'll stop waffling now and let you be on your way. Thank you for your stay at the keep, and I hope we'll see you again soon.